Good morning and welcome back. My name is Anthony Suhu and I teach here at the Pontifical Biblical Institute. It is my great pleasure to introduce the section on ancient Near Eastern and biblical languages for this conference on motion and gesture. We will have 4 speakers this morning, and we will wait until after each of the speakers have presented and have a 30-minute discussion. So please save your questions for the end. Our first 2 speakers are Father Mark Avila and Peter Dubovsky. Father Mark Avila did his dissertation at the University of California, Berkeley, writing on Sumerian and Akkadian snake incantations from the Ur-3 and Old Babylonian periods. He currently teaches at the Pontifical Biblical Institute, Sumerian and Akkadian language and literature. His presentation today will be on Sumerian phrasal verbs.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Here we have 2 early dynastic, so early 3rd millennium BC votive figures of supplicants or worshipers from the Sumerian city of Eshnunna in central Mesopotamia. The characteristic extra-large eyes serve to introduce the topic for today on Sumerian phrasal verbs, particularly those involving the attention verbs of sight. Since, as Aristotle argues, nature is the principle of motion, that's an abridgment up there, perhaps with a little adaptation, we can gain an insight into the thinking of the people who brought us writing, the inhabitants of what is today southern Iraq, whose language the Semitic-speaking Akkadians called Shumeru. Now, the importance of Sumerian cannot be underestimated. It retained its status as a prestige language long before it died off as a first language, and it remained the language of scholarship and cult until the end of the 1st millennium BC, right up to the Christian era. It also left its mark on the Akkadian family of Semitic languages, including Babylonian and Assyrian, not least of all in the writing system, but also by contributing to that family's Eastern character, we might say. Not this one. But this one is the original tablet. And it is with a tablet such as this that humanity was brought into the first information age. By phrasal verb, I mean a fixed idiomatic combination of a noun and a verb to express a verbal meaning for which there exists no specific simple verb. Sumerian possesses many of such idiomatic combinations, making up for a lack of what are called attention verbs, namely those expressing sense perception, particularly involving sight or hearing. These phrasal verbs are made up of a nominal element, I, for example, and some general verb of motion. It's a place where one would never expect a verb of motion, so it is truly lost in translation. A wonderful proverb will illustrate how such phrasal verbs work. Here, we have an exploded view of an exquisite tablet in the Yale Babylonian collection. It comes from the Old Babylonian period, so the early 2nd millennium BC. So it's roughly 6 by 13 by 3 centimeters in dimension. It contains a collection of proverbs. Many such collections survive as scribal exercises. As they copied these proverbs, apprentice scribes learned the subtleties of Sumerian syntax and grammar with its ample use of phrasal verbs. What interests us is the obverse. This is a copy of the obverse. It is a collection of proverbs involving animals, as you can see. There are 5 different animals featured in the first line of each of the different proverbs. These photos are not to scale, by the way. So as I was looking over this presentation, it's the 6th proverb that caught my attention. And it's not a part of this presentation, but I could not resist reading it for you. So it's umbin sua iudusce bancuku, which means, and so I'm going to say it, and I'm going to have to repeat it in Italian for a very specific reason. So I would translate it: the cat's claw made it into the tallow. Tallow is sheep's fat. Okay, so in Italian it would be gli artigli del gatto sono finiti nel lardo. So qui il lardo è grasso ovino, molto appetibile ai gatti. So it's a proverb that maps perfectly onto the Italian, which is tanto va la gatta al lardo. Okay, but it doesn't continue in Sumerian. It does in Italian, che ci lascia lo zampino, but it doesn't continue in Sumerian. So see, this is why I say that Sumerian must be taught in Italian. So here we go. A note to those who are unfamiliar with Assyriological conventions, you'll see the number there that is circled. This index number serves to distinguish homophone graphemes. Since two or more signs can share the same transliteration, for reasons that are unimportant here, an index number serves simply to distinguish one sign from another with the same transliteration. Hyphens link graphemes that constitute a word. Okay, so here we go. The last animal, which you would expect is, which I waited to show you, is, as you can see in the green there, the circle in the green, it shows up many times in these proverbs. So it's a typical animal for this kind of genre. We can think of the Aesop's fables and so forth. Okay, let me draw your attention to the very first proverb. Now, it begins with what we saw there with Mashda, which is the gazelle. Okay, so it begins, with Mashda, and then the gazelle, and then it continues with which is a generic term for any kind of predatory animal of the canine or the feline family, but usually it refers to the wild dog or the lion. So here, I think contextually, it certainly is the lion that is referred to. Now, the third line, Lu, which is man, is this is the point of the proverb. Okay, you will notice a recurring word, igi, which is the word for eye, the nominal part of different phrasal verbs involving sight, of course. The differences lie in the verbal element. Two are verbs of motion. One is a causative of a stative. Okay, so la means to stretch out, nal means to cause, here it means to be there or cause to be there, make be there. And the other one is, duh is to release or to loosen or to open. Now, my translation aims to capture the different nuances of these phrasal verbs while maintaining the idiomatic quality. A gazelle not keeping an eye out, a lion not having kept an eye open, a man having raised his hands does not use his eyes. Okay, now I will turn these phrasal verbs into simple attention verbs, here translated as adjectives. So a gazelle that is not watchful, a lion that has not been observant, a man having raised his hands, we'll get back to that later, is blind. Okay. We have two animals here constituting a merism, a polar expression. One, an animal of prey that must always be alert or it will be attacked and killed. The other, a predatory animal that must always be on the lookout for its prey, otherwise it will starve. There is a studied ambiguity, however, in the third member, the man whose hands are raised. Having hands raised is an ambiguous gesture. The Sumerian phrasal verb, to raise the hands, is used in two very different contexts with very different meanings. Meanings also reflected in the Akkadian glosses. For example, the common Akkadian translation for this expression is nadru, which means raising, said of lions, wild bulls, gods, and demons, for example. Therefore, A raging man is blind. Another quite literal translation is kati nashu, one raising the hand. So it's a very literal translation. But it is something that is typical, it's a phraseology that is found typically in what is done before the gods when supplicating them. Thus, the supplicating man. Now, we've seen different phrasal verbs for our to see, to look, or for our to rage, to supplicate. Before we move on, just a word on the interpretation of the proverb. What then is its meaning? A man who has his hands raised in rage is like the lion whose predatory instinct is not employed for its survival. It is pure aggression, that of the bully who dominates and commands total control through intimidation. Conversely, a man who has his hands raised in supplication before the god is like the blind gazelle, passive, leaving his fate to the agency of others. Here we seem to get a glimpse of a certain cynicism regarding the ability or the will of the gods to help humanity. Let's look at another proverb with a similar three-part structure, where again, the third part constitutes the lesson to be imparted. Okay, it too involves the mashda, gazelle. In this proverb, however, the agent always remains the same. It's lu, as does the verbal element of these phrasal verbs. Okay, tuku, which means to have. The nominal element, however, is what changes in each of these. Okay, so you have, hold on a second. Okay, the nominal element. So you have dub, which means the knees, of course. So having knees, you have which is the arm, to have an arm or have arms. And you have ka, which is mouth, to have a mouth. Okay. So this is, this is the translation that I offer. A swift man caught a gazelle. A strong man was able to carry it off. An eloquent man brought it into the palace. Thus, clearly, the idea is that to be swift or strong is not as important as being well-spoken. So I quote a great scholar on this: the accomplished or well-developed person was someone who spoke well and effectively, who was highly intelligent and understanding, and who was far-sighted or visionary. Sight and hearing were also stressed in representational art, in which eyes and ears were often large in proportion to the head or face. So remember the image at the beginning of the presentation. The proverb probably implies also that eloquence can make up for speed and strength, or as we say, brains over brawn. We might find an echo in scripture of the elements of this proverb. So take, for example, Psalm 147. Lov shokeh ha'ish yirseh. So the Lord does not take delight in the thighs or quadriceps of man. So he's not impressed with human feats. He takes delight in those who fear him. Or perhaps for the having arms, Psalm 44 says, Zro'am lohoshi'al lamo. Their arm will not save them. So these two elements are obviously placed in a different category as opposed to the third category, which is the mouth. And here we remember what Moses says when he refers to himself as kavad peh ukvad lashon anochi. So I am heavy of mouth and heavy of tongue. So this was his complaint. He didn't want to go and speak to Pharaoh because of his lack of eloquence, apparently. So the Lord says, I'll be your mouth, or I'll be with your mouth. By the way, that's interesting because we do find the word tongue as a variant in this proverb. And it's easy to make the switch from mouth to tongue because this is a sign for mouth. Tongue is simply the phonetic complement, me, placed inside so that you know that the word is to be pronounced eme as tongue. Okay. Now, besides those who have done or are doing Sumerian or Akkadian, biblicists should recognize this Sumerian word, which has been loaned into Hebrew. Anyone? No Akkadists here. Nobody? Anyone study Hebrew here? Okay, the word is hijal. It means big house, and it comes to us directly from, well, indirectly from the Sumerian. Okay, it's a word for palace. Fine. As mentioned earlier, the writing of Proverbs was a part of the ancient scribes' school curriculum. We find individual proverbs written on what are called lenticular tablets, a bun-shaped tablet used in the scribal schools, measuring an average of 7 to 10 centimeters in diameter. These were school practice tablets. This one contains an entire proverb inscribed by the teacher in a clear hand on the flat side, and on the other side, the convex part, is the poorer hand of the student. I give here a linear word-for-word translation of the Sumerian, and next to it, one in flowing English. Okay, so here we go. A judge having perverted justice, cursing with right arm, alienates a young son from his father's house. This is an abomination, or this is something disordered for an Anurta. An Anurta is this warrior god, also he's a god of an agricultural kind of a god. It's a very ancient Sumerian god, and somehow he's interested in justice. Okay, so we find another phrasal verb, and it's bala, to turn. That's the verbal part, obviously, and then ash, which is curse, and it means simply to curse, here in a non-finite form. Modifying ash bala is this zida, as you can see there, underlined. Fortunately, we have the same proverb in an entire collection of proverbs, and here it is. There is our proverb right there in blue. So it's in a collection, not just on its own, like in the lenticular tablet. And there, instead of zida, we have ziga. Okay, a non-finite form of yet another verbal phrase, where the phrasal verb azig, which means to lift the arms, which are arms which we saw in the previous proverb. Okay, and it translates to use violence, to be aggressive. Okay, and the noun means then to be violence, and it's translated here adverbally, cursing violently. Now this makes much more sense. Okay, so this reminds us of the raised arms of the raised arms of the Israelites as they were leaving. They were in Exodus. They were with Bayal Ramah, translated in all these different ways, and none of them can seem to agree on the meaning. Okay. Now, to conclude, in addition to what we've already seen, here are other phrasal verbs construed with the word for I, and different verbs of movement, or some of state. Okay, so you have igigub, which means to stand the eye, or igisig, which means to place the eye, and both of them mean simply, we translate both without the motion, we translate them both to see. Then you have igibar, which means to bring out the eye, or you can extend that and say igizidbar, to bring out the right eye, which means to look upon favorably. You have igi ngar, which means to set the eye, igi il, to raise the eye, and igi tab, to double the eye. And these are all translated as, oh, I'm sorry, I haven't advanced the, yes, I have. Yeah, they all translate as to look. Okay, then we have, sorry about that, we have another set of phrasal verbs with more figurative meanings. Okay, so you have the first one there, igi, okay, let's go back there. So igi gid, which means to make long the eye, and you can expand that, make long the small eye, and it's even much more negative. If igi gid means to look angrily, igi tur gid means to look contemptuously, or something like that, right? So you have igi hulu, to make bad the eye, which means to look with envy. You have igi kara, which means to shine the eye, meaning to inspect. Igisag, that's a nice one, to make pretty the eye, which means to look with favor. We have a verb whose meaning we don't know on its own, but together with igi, it means to check. And then we have igitum, to bring the eye, which means to spy. Now, a couple of my favorite phrasal verbs. This one is ki ang, and it means to measure a place for, and it means to love. This one is shuti, to move close to the hand, and it means to accept. And this one you'll love, I'm sure. Speaking of love, is Amar Gi, which means return to mother, and it means to free. Okay, so this is not part of the presentation, but I thought I should conclude this way, referring to that cynicism which we might have detected in the Sumerian proverb. So here is an exquisite one. It's Ka Ngaltaga Nimbang Kuku. And it means into the open mouth enters the fly. Okay? Now, it's on its own, it can mean anything. It can mean talk is cheap, right? But together with this next one, oops, sorry about that. Got to get the full experience there. So together with the next one, Sishkure Namtil Yutud. So it's offerings, physical offerings that produce life. So on that note, I guess I should probably go ahead and close my mouth.